for being here today and for your presentation in advance. And over to you.
Thank you, Marla. I will share my screen. Oh, okay. Okay. I'll try it again. Here we go. This one there. Share.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, how does that look like?
Perfect.
Okay, so I do not see comments in the section. So Marla, if there is anything problematic, let me know, because I do not see anything beyond my screen. And I would like to ask you, if you have any questions, keep them at the end. We have about a half an hour to discuss and ask question afterwards. So, hvala još jednom na pozivu i što ste mi dali priliku dati ovo predavanje. So today, what I'm going to talk about is the pathways to nature positive, healthy, and inclusive food systems. As Marla mentioned, it is part of our environmental portfolio, environmental area of action. The key message that I want to tell you to talk about today is that the need to transformation of our agricultural land systems and design them around the agroecological principles. Can you please turn off the microphones? So there is some feedback going on. Thank you. So what we need to do, we need to effectively restore and maintain farmland biodiversity, while in the same time we have to ensure productive and social culturally valued agroecosystems. And that is the area where we think about inclusion, because if we work in separately protecting biodiversity or separately thinking about the food security and food production, we will exclude a large portion of our communities and their interest. So the presentation that I'm giving today is the view of the world according to biologists, conservationists, and I do have some agroecology training. So nature conservation will be quite prominent, kind of a light line in the background of my presentation, which is mostly focused on food security and sustainable food production. The reason what I've been talking about this topic is I'm trying to connect two world of conservation biology and world for agriculture production, because we are dealing with a lot of complex problems, and to address and try to solve complex problems, we have to have a system approach. We cannot separately think about nature conservation and food production. We have to think about solutions that will address problems that are existing in a both system. And I'm a little bit disappointed when I look at the participants today. I do not see too many people from the conservation community, and I did send a lot of invitations. So I'll just give you a little bit of introduction that the things are possible and background that I come from different cultures and different environment. If you can kind of figure it out from my accent, I was born in the land far, far away. And what you see here, the picture is from one field in Croatia. It's an island of Hvar that has been in continuous food production from over 3,000 years. So on Canadian and North American standard, maybe when you look at the landscapes, it is not particularly, not maybe matching the standards of productivities that we expect here in North America. However, the system is sustainable. And as I mentioned, producing food and feeding people for over 3,000 years. And what is really interesting for that particular field, we do have the names of farmers and their families who were producing food in that area 2,400 years ago. So it's really neat system where we have this incorporation of agroecological practices and regenerative agriculture in a food system, which makes it sustainable. You can see here just the landscape, how people integrated the terrace system to retain the moisture and use the soil characteristics of each kind of area that they're farming. And what I want to bring in here is that issue of sufficiency, right? We kind of, when we think about the food production in North America, is focused on higher yield and higher productivity, which did, in fact, lower the food prices, regardless what we want to think about how much we spend on food, but proportionally to our incomes, our food prices are relatively low. So by lowering food prices through focusing on agricultural productivity and the trade, it does reduce prices and increase availability. However, affordability of the food items has improved over time, but food systems of all types have fallen short of delivery optimal nutrition. So we're thinking about the health aspect of the food and the health outcomes. And also we kind of reduce the environmental sustainability. And we also reduce the inclusion and equity of all participants in this food system. What we are thinking about is we do produce a lot of food, but that food is promoting food system efficiency because we, as I'm going to show, we waste a lot of food, and also there's quite a large increase in obesity and in the system of inequality. There are parts of populations which are receiving a lot of high caloric food, so we have less expensive food, but the less favorable outcomes for nutrition, environmental health, and inclusion and equity that I already mentioned. So we have externalized the cost, so we are actually not incorporating the cost of the food production in our cost of food that we are sharing with the population. So that externalization of the food production has a negative impact on health and environment, right? So in effort to increase and maintain crop yields, agricultural production had rapidly intensified over the last 6 decades, relying heavily on agrochemicals, the fertilizers, insecticides, and fungicide, right? When you see the set of graphs on the prairies, fertilizers were applied on 78% and herbicides on 81% of cropland areas, right? There is a dramatic increase in the use of fungicides and insecticides between 96 and 2016 at the graphs that we see here. And all of those applications of external chemicals have a very high environmental cost of the agriculture intensification, right? When we're approaching for the conventional high input agriculture. So the question that I have is the abundant and cheaper food really desirable, right? We have witnessed extensive food waste and rise in obesity. Globally, 30 to 40% of the food is being wasted. In Canada, I found one study that the food waste could be even higher, close to 50%, right? So increased production and abundant and cheaper food does not necessarily translate into healthier and nutrient-dense food. Besides environmental costs, there are also social economic costs to food production, right? That agriculture intensification. What you see here is the gross graph that represents the gross farm revenue and realized net income with government subsidies subtracted, right? They're not included in cost. So what we see here, that the net farm income in high input, high output, and high energy use agriculture production model, we increasingly use the large quantities of fuel and agrochemicals, and that the increased cost lowers farmers' net income the money the producers effectively earn. So if we have a system that reduce the amount of fuel and reduce the amount of agrochemicals that we use in food production, we will reduce the input that producers need to include in their production, and hopefully that will increase their net income, and that might help with the justice and also inclusion of a larger proportion of the population in food production. So humanity is facing a dual crisis, and that is climate emergency and biodiversity loss, right? We can also add the occasional pandemics in a mix. The way we use and manage land has a connection to the strong impact of all these factors. So when we look at the climate emergency, loss of biological diversity, and pandemic zoonotic diseases, what they have in common is land use. So land use is central to addressing sustainability issues, right? Including biodiversity conservation, climate change, and food security. So we have to have a system approach to solving those issues that I mentioned here. We cannot look and deal with them separately. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, better known as IPBES, that is the organization parallel to the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. They released an assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This landmark report warns us that the nature and biosphere integrity are declining globally at rates of unprecedented in human history. The report also stressed that the need for a fundamental change how we interact with natural environment. There's a growing understanding of the links between diversity and ecosystem function and services, in other words, nature's contribution to people, and also the impact of biodiversity on the resilience of systems to disturbance. So improving biological and functional diversity, both on the farm and on the landscape level, would greatly contribute to food system stability and climate change reduction. So the conservation of species diversity in agricultural landscapes is crucial, not only to stop the overall decline of biodiversity, but also to ensure the maintenance of multiple biological functions, some of them delivering important services in our food systems. So when we look at the biodiversity, we also have to look at the climate change, the second large issue that we have to deal with. In the same year, in 2019, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released their own special report on climate change and land with a warning that we have to fundamentally change how we manage the land, how we produce and consume food, and we have to substantially reduce food waste in order to minimize the effects of climate change. So just in the context, showing what's happening here in Canada, the increased greenhouse gas emissions have been linked to rising temperatures. Since 1948, Canada's annual average temperature over the land has warmed by 1.7 degrees Celsius. We, on average, experience warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. The Canadian Arctic is warming even faster rate, right? So that is a problem and situation that we are facing here in Canada. Warming will also intensify the severity and heat waves and also contribute to higher risk of drought and wildfires. So drought, what you see picture here is a drought in 21 near Saskatoon. And in addition to the swings in extreme heat episode, we will witness more intense rainfall events, and that will increase the risk of floods. What you see here, the image, is of the flooding in Maple Creek after a week of intense rains in June of 2010. And we see these extreme temperatures. I kind of took a screenshot. On the 11th of March of 22, daytime low was minus 34. That was at night. And then a day later, daytime high was plus 3 degrees Celsius. So we will see more extreme temperature swings like that, what we experienced with Professor Catherine Hayhoe, quite well-known climate scientist, named global weirding. So we'll see some really weird stuff. So how much are we impacting the status of Earth systems? Scientists from the Global Resilience System in Stockholm, they've introduced the concept of planetary boundaries and a safe operating space for humanity. So planetary boundaries are intended to represent Earth system processes, which, if pushed over certain limits, could generate unacceptable system change that we might not be able to recover from. So as you can see from the illustration, we have overstepped 4 out of 8 safe planetary boundaries. And 4 that you see here, biodiversity loss, impacted mostly by the land use change, nitrogen and phosphorus overload, land system change, and climate change. So what do biogeochemical flows, land system change, biosphere integrity, and climate change have in common? All of those factors actually have a connection with the agriculture. And the agriculture, when we think about it, is the largest interface between humanity and the natural world. And that's why I'm interested in impact of agricultural production on sustainability of natural systems, right? So, oops, there's some happening here. When we look at here, it's agri-suicide. So agriculture and global food systems are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss due to habitat loss, greenhouse gas emissions impacting climate. At the same time, food production is negatively impacted by those anthropogenic pressures. So I found in some papers, people asking, are we really committing agri-suicide? That the impact of the natural environment, it's really going to impact our ability to produce safely, sustainably, produce a healthy food. Here, what I'm going to talk a lot about the agroecology and the regenerative agriculture. Just a basic concept that the agroecology, for people who are not familiar with, uses ecological concepts and principles for the design and management of agricultural systems. So agroecology promotes nature-based processes and also relies on the enhancement of functional biodiversity to deliver services to agriculture. And some of them, most familiar people are, it's a natural pest control and crop pollination. So they're just kind of a background, what we have here. So fate, what is the fate of nature in agricultural landscapes? So agricultural activities are considered to be the single largest driver of environmental change. For example, over 80% of native grasslands in North America have been converted to crop production and other uses. And agriculture is the leading cause of biodiversity loss through land use change. What do we see in our agricultural landscapes? Natural features quite often like shelter belts and wetlands are being removed from agricultural landscapes at an increasing rate with marginal increases in yield. I found a US study that for the land use change 2008-2016, cropland have expanded at the rate of over 1 million acres a year, whereas this around 70% of new cropland areas produce yield below the national average. So the cropland expansion, at least for the US study, produced marginally yields increase at high cost to the biodiversity and nature. The current model of high input, intensive production of agricultural commodities, they rank high in provisioning services, meaning high crop yields, but only provide low levels of regulating, supporting, and cultural services. So agriculture intensification for monoculture is leading to simplification of landscape structure. We lose biodiversity, and also we lose potential reduction in system resilience. So loss of biodiversity threatens provisioning of ecosystem functioning services and will ultimately impact food security and agricultural sustainability. Let's talk a little bit about the biodiversity in agroecosystems. The functioning of agroecosystems is dependent on biodiversity. Most biodiversity issues need landscape scale consideration and planning, and that's what I'm trying to present today, because of the tendency of many living organisms to spread and colonize new habitat, and also interactions at the multiple levels. We still do not understand that how biodiversity impact ecosystem function, not only on the field or a farm level, but also on landscape level, right? So spatial arrangement of croplands and semi-natural field edge habitats can especially promote functional biodiversity and yield-enhancing ecosystem services. So example of land management strategy that benefit food production and nature are shelter beds and prairie strips in shared lands. In other words, wildlife-friendly agricultural landscapes. So the key point in my presentation is that in addition to creating more dedicated protected areas to conserve biodiversity, we need to consider designing agricultural landscape as a mosaic of land uses. We have to consider incorporating our landscapes agroecology-based farmland, wildlife-friendly working lands, such as maybe ranch land and pasture land, and we also have to incorporate protected area networks at various spatial scale. So the working landscapes need at least 20% of native habitat. So to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem function, so we can benefit from nature contribution to humanity. So increased diversification of crop systems and landscape structure will enhance agroecosystem performance and resilience of food systems. So what we need to do, we need to upscale the application of regenerative and agroecological farming practices to increase stability of our food systems. And also that will help reduce the amount of agrochemical inputs and improve farm profitability, in many cases without compromising yields. So this is one of the examples of what we can do to enhance diversity of the above and below ground biological communities, not only with the landscape level, but also with the diversification of agriculture practices that you see some examples here. What we need to do, we have to focus and give more attention to biodiversity and especially functional diversity of ecosystems through enhancing on-farm and landscape scale diversities for cropping system, but also heterogeneity of the landscapes. We should be able to design and manage agricultural landscapes for better delivery of biodiversity-based ecosystem services. So what is important? It is important to think about and work on spatial arrangement of cropland and semi-natural habitat that will enhance edge density of the surface areas and particularly promote functional biodiversity and yield-enhancing ecosystem services. So the threat of climate change and habitat degradation have a strong impact on biodiversity, where species are forced to adjust and migrate through fragmented landscape. So my question is, are we providing adequate space and landscape through well-connected habitat patches for the species to move around to more suitable areas to survive and reproduce. And that is especially going to be important with the increased threat of climate change impact. So talking a little bit more about the biodiversity in agricultural landscapes, maintaining and enhancing biodiversity with agricultural systems may reduce the trade-offs between food production and ecosystem health, and that will increase agro-ecosystem resilience in the face of global environmental change. So how do we get more biodiversity-based ecosystem services? One example are natural, semi-natural prairie and flower strips along the field edges or road allowances. They serve as a refuge for pollinator and crop pest controlling insects. Did you know that up to 40% pollination is done by insects other than bees, right? That is why it's important to maintain natural features in agricultural landscapes to provide refuge for those beneficial insects. And why is that important? Pollination improves production of 70% of globally most important crops and influence 35% of global food supply. So the path forward to find a common solution and make the UN Convention on Biological Diversity vision of living in harmony with nature reality, we have to bridge the gap between agriculture and nature conservation. So we have to think about both aspects. We need to apply transformative change and move beyond the quest for sustainable land use and focus our efforts on achieving sustainability through land use. So what you see here, it's a graph. What we need to do to reverse the global biodiversity decline. We need to implement ambitious conservation effort beyond protected areas, but also we need to have transformative change in the food production system that will incorporate more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption by reducing the food waste. What we need to do, we need to protect what is left. We need to properly manage what we have. Also, we need to restore what has been lost by intrusion into landscape through our agricultural production. So what is a transformative vision? Some of the example what we could look forward and work on. We need to reimagine the food system and integrate food production with biodiversity conservation beyond strict protected areas. We need to structure our food systems in a way to turn from a primary threat to primary solution space for human and environmental health. So we need to work in a three main area. We need to reduce pressure on land by changing food consumption, and that will be demand side of intervention. And we need more sustainable consumption. Second, we need to adopt more nature-friendly farming practices and improve on-farm and supply chain efficiencies that will deal with the supply side and more sustainable production through agroforestry, agroecological practices, and regenerative or restorative farming ranching practices. And third, we need to set aside land for nature. We need more protected areas. So what is the path forward? So we can maybe think and discuss in a discussion part of the session. We need to design and manage agricultural lands on a landscape scale. We have to think and discuss and work towards landscape configuration to be managed to best maintain ecosystem processes. And we need to promote productivity of the agricultural land and increase food system resilience on multiple levels, right? Second, we need to promote co-creation and sharing of knowledge. We need to facilitate active producer contribution to economic understanding and development of locally appropriate knowledge in food production. The aim is for the producers and users, the whole system, to recognize the importance of ecosystem services as an integral part of the food production operations. And thirdly, We need to deal and strengthen local governments or local decision-making, where we need to promote and support equitable participation of local communities and indigenous peoples in decision-making process. It is critical to incorporate their knowledge and perspectives about agroecological approaches. What we need to work towards, facilitating the role of non-state actors such as NGOs, cities, and businesses, is responding to global environmental and food security challenges. Unfortunately, we see a lesser influence of our political and government systems, regardless of the level, provincial and federal. And I think the way forward is for the civil society to be more engaged in local decision-making. It's going to be difficult, but we do need to move forward beyond our current political systems that we cannot, unfortunately, rely on too much. So in closing, I would like to repeat what is the key message of my presentation. We need to transformation of agricultural land system based on agroecological principles. And what would the benefits of this approach if we design the agroecological systems on a landscape scale, if there is designed appropriately? These landscapes can provide habitats for biodiversity. They will promote connectivity between protected areas and increase the capacity of the food system to respond to environmental and ecological disturbances. We need to reduce the threat to biodiversity with a comprehensive spatial planning for diverse agricultural benefiting biodiversity conservation and nature contribution to people. And also, we need to meet people's need through sustainable land use and benefit sharing, right? So the farmers and food producers will benefit from diversified systems through increased economic resilience, and they will reduce dependency of agroecological inputs. So that will provide us with a sustainable system and more diverse and nutritious food. So that will be the end of my presentation. So we could move to the area questions and discussion. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks very much, Branimir. That was an incredibly informative presentation. I don't think you could have picked a more prime example of the problems than in the Great Plains region, really, of North America. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that a lot of those photos are Branimir's. I mean, they're just incredible photos, shots of the prairies. Okay, so now let's open it up to questions. And if you have a question, please just go ahead and speak. I mean, we can also do the hand raising thing if under reactions, if you look under reactions, that's where you can find the hand raising. Does anybody want to take the plunge? Lynn, please go ahead. Lynn Oliphant.
Lynn, you're not allowed to ask questions.
Okay, I won't ask questions. I'll make comments.
Just easy ones. Just easy ones.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for a very interesting talk and certainly pointing out many of our problems. As I see it, from a biodiversity standpoint, primarily, is that the only real solution, I mean, granted, there's many things that can be done, and you pointed many of them out in terms of better agricultural systems, more diversity, etc. Keeping our wetlands, it's a no-brainer that these are good things. Reducing our waste, great thing. But the overall implication is what we're doing is preparing for a world with perhaps as many as 11 or 12 billion people, and we're well on the way there, all desiring a very diverse and healthy diet from all over the world. And in terms of the biodiversity, it's the scale of the human enterprise that's the issue. We're expecting that we can usurp the vast majority of the productivity of the planet for our own use. And in order to do that, we use science and technology to remove limits to growth. And so all of our agriculture, ranging from our fertilizers and insecticides, etc., to our huge combines and tractors, all depend on fossil fuel. And of course, we know that we're in a climate crisis because of that. So we're between, in my mind, between a rock and a hard place. If we are truly going to address the overshoot that you've shown in one of your slides, the only solution that I see is to reduce the scale of the human enterprise. That means either the number of people on the planet or our per capita expectation in terms of our usage of the bounties of the planet, because everything that we use is not available to the rest of the perhaps 30 million organisms that we share the planet with. We don't share well. So I think we're in a very difficult situation. And I'll give just one example of where I think we are attempting to solve the problem of having a huge population of humans without destroying the biodiversity of the planet. And that's going to a more plant-based diet. If what we're saying when we're going to a more plant-based diet is we want to eat lower in the food chain, which allows us to have more people. If we were all obligate carnivores, we'd never have reached 8 billion people. So we're in a situation, if we are going to follow this this direction of eating lower and lower on the food chain, it means things like we're going to harvest the plankton of the ocean rather than the fish. And when you harvest the plankton to utilize directly, we can certainly get more calories and maybe even good nutrition. But that means there are no fish and there are no sea mammals that feed on the fish. So as I see it, it's a scale problem, and we're really in a situation currently in overshoot, and the solutions to that aren't good no matter how we go about it.
Thank you, Lynn, for your comments. Is indeed the human consumption and the number of people on the planet is going to be the level of consumption, type consumption, and the number of people is quite a problematic issue. We do see a slowing of the human population in some part of the world. Definitely Europe and Asia. China is actually reducing the population growth. Now India is overtook China in the number of people. There is a lot of population growth. The next boom is going to be in Africa. So there is a problem there, but it is the rate of the human population is decreasing. The rate of increase is decreasing. In terms of your comments on the basically how we use food and what do we eat, whether we eat protein like an animal-based protein or plant-based protein, that is part of the solutions that I mentioned in the transformative vision. So we do need to, one of the way to deal with the problem is demand side interventions. What kind of food we eat, we had to adjust our dietary patterns with more plant-based, because in terms of energy conversion, we would get more nutritious and, well, more calorie sufficient food for the plant-based diet. We still need some animal plant food. And also, we drastically need to reduce the food waste, because if we waste 30 to 40% of our food, that is a huge loss of available nutrition that we have to the population. We also need to change the distribution, more equitable distribution. And by reducing the food waste, we will also reduce the impact of food system on climate change, where if you include all of the aspects, distribution, transportation, and waste, the food system is responsible to about 34 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So there are two approaches. One is demand side, reduce demand, but also we need with the supply side part of the equation, where we need to have more sustainable food production by incorporating more nature-friendly farming practices. And also we need to improve the supply chain efficiencies. I'm really happy to see that we more application of regenerative and restorative farming and ranching practices. And there is, especially from the smaller producers and kind of a younger producers, there's a bit of a dichotomy that we see more middle-sized producers applying those regenerative practices, whereas larger producers work towards kind of efficiency through scale, rather than efficiency through sustainability of agriculture production. But you're right, in both aspects. These are some of the approaches that we need to work with to deal with transformation of the food system. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to ask people in the order that their hands went up. So Paul Hanley, you're next.
Thanks a lot, Branimir. Really good. I'm interested in the actual kind of techniques that people could adopt to become more nature-friendly in their farming practices. And you talked about like the kind of prairie strips along the edges of fields. I was also interested in road allowances, and I think there are a lot of road allowances that generally just get used because they're not actually used for roads. They could just get used by the neighboring farmers, but if they could be, I mean, do you know much about if there have been efforts to kind of convert those root allowances into the kind of plantings that you would advocate?
Yes, that is really good. That is one of the way that we could convert and kind of make some of those lands more nature friendly. And I will talk about the road allowances. There's a group in New York that they're trying to promote the restoration of road allowances. There are not, in quite a few instances, they were brought into the agricultural productions, which is illegal. But that is the decision to the local RMs, how they're going to manage that. So some of the issues that we have, some of the solutions, as you mentioned, are shelter belts, prairie strips, and using the land that is not used to like a road allowances to make it more nature friendly. When we look, there is one issue that we can discuss is when you look at the scientific literature and people who think a lot about it, is the way forward would be have a smaller agricultural field, and a larger proportion of those fields will have nature positive border areas, whether they're prairie strips or shelter belts, and some of the areas that would serve as a refuge for pollinators and for the species that control undesirable insects, so the pest control insects. So increasing the ratio of those semi-natural habitat to the crop production. Unfortunately, when we think about the efficiency There was a study that I found in the States with the organic farmers. Smaller producers do tend to incorporate more agroecological practices, whereas the larger producers really work more on the production efficiency and incorporating fewer agroecological and nature-friendly practices. Whether they are basically working and pressed with the cost of production, where having a larger fields, you need to invest more money into equipment and more technology. And when you do need to have returns to pay for those farm machinery. However, some of the concept where people talk about the total factor productivity, so the income or return on investment on the larger farms is better on larger farms. However, that does not incorporate the cost, environmental cost of the production. And that is what people need. We need to think about something called green factor productivity when we incorporate also those nature-friendly areas into the food production. So there are, in addition to agroecological practices, where there's a cover crops, incorporating livestock into crop production, intercropping, again, incorporation of prairie strips, shelter belts, a lot of the measures that we could incorporate in our food production. What you're asking about those semi-natural habitats, the improvement, we need to incorporate more of those because it will help our food production by retaining moisture, capturing more carbon, increase soil organic carbon in our lands, but also those areas will improve habitat capacity for biodiversity that we could use and benefit from, especially through pollination and pest control. So we do need to have dual approach, both incorporating more nature-friendly agroecological farming practices, but incorporating more of those nature-friendly semi-natural habitats that you mentioned. So how we incorporate that, there is a movement. People are becoming more aware. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, unfortunately, we are reaching a critical stage where people are really realizing that we are messing up our landscapes, and they are more willing to do something about it. So I do see a happy future and more positive and promising future. We just have to promote and give a talks and then just kind of promote those ideas that I've been doing for a long time now.
I'll just put a plug in for one missing aspect that you haven't touched on, which is the export orientation of a limited number of commodities in the prairie region. We're locked into a globalized food system, and it's resulting in these monocultures, intensive livestock operations that, like, we're not really feeding the local demand. We're feeding global markets. So anyhow, sorry.
No, this is good. Just add to it. Like, I really get I rail it up when people talk about we need to increase production of foodstuff to feed the world. Right now, if we have an equal distribution and proper distribution, we produce enough food to feed every person on the planet. Right? So it's issue of access, it's issue of distribution. When we talk about increasing production of foodstuff, I would ask, are we really increasing production of export commodities, not food? If we are increasing production of export commodities, then we need to think about agriculture as industrial activities and work with safeguards and measures what is the social and environmental impact of that in quote industrial production, rather than have kind of a fuzzy a warm feeling about producing food to feed the world.
Good. Okay, Joseph, please go ahead.
Yes, Branimir, you showed the slide, the very first, about the 3,000-year-old farmland in Croatia, which looked very, very beautiful, lots of nature, and very productive. Can you tell us a little bit? Do they use chemicals there? What do they use to nurture the soil to get such production over such a long period of time?
Then do not use a lot of agrochemicals, and then do not use a lot of heavy and invasive mechanical work on the land for several reasons. One is the fields are small. You cannot use big machinery. Machinery is expensive, and also chemical is expensive. So that is one positive aspect where we have that low intensive agriculture production. And also it's tradition, the way how the fathers and grandfathers produced food. It's really traditional, and people have a lot of pride in producing food in sustainable manner. And that is why I mentioned that the idea of sufficiency, producing food that feeds your family, and you do have a bit of extra food and value added food, then you can sell on the market and generate income that way. For example, you saw that grape collection with the family that I stayed with. They harvest the grapes, they produce absolutely fantastic wine, absolutely fantastic olive oil, and they market those products on the local market and generate income that way. That adds to basically supporting their family in addition to the food that they grow on the land, right? So there are multiple factors why we do not see more intensive. That is, there is one thing I want to show you, really interesting, that I didn't want to mention during the talk because it will use up a lot of time. I want to show you something in the background here. So there's a guy loading up. So if you see this patch here, what happened is lavender production is quite prevalent on this part of the island. However, lavender is grown on more open and very thin soil and requires a lot of sunshine. So what I suspect somebody did here is cut the forest on the slope, which is more drained and also probably does not generate a lot of sunlight, a lot of heat sufficient for growing lavender, which is then pressed and sell as an oil. So there's one experiment with somebody wanted to expand and produce food produce kind of growing certain product in the land that was not suitable for that kind of production. So that is one example where people did something that was not smartest idea, right? So it is a kind of experiment, fortunately, because there's a lot of moisture there, and that food, if the field is going to be abandoned and really that lavender is scruffy and it's not producing a lot of lavender oil, that will grow back into the forested area.
Several years ago, I hiked the northern route in Spain along the Camino, and I went through the Basque region, which is a very, very lush, rich agricultural area, and they were very good at combining their agriculture with nature.
Yes.
And I also noticed that all the knolls, and there's a lot of clumps of trees, and this is a Moorish type of agriculture, and the trees pull the water table up, whereas in southern Spain, they cleaned all the trees off, and so they had to do irrigation. And so one way, by keeping the trees, you can pull the water table up 100, 200 feet. And so this keeps the land well watered and reduces or eliminates the need for irrigation. But I wanted to say that there's other small, like Alan Savory, who's been recovering desert lands in Africa, and there's multiple mixed farms with animals and plants, and he's done an amazing job. Then there's Joe Salatin in West Virginia with the Polyface farm, 200 acres feeding hundreds of people, and he makes a darn good living. So my belief is that it's a fallacy to think that this industrial chemicalized agriculture is needed to feed the world with nutrient poor food. And we just look at the health of the people now, obesity, and you have to ask yourself, is that the way we want to go? And so I think that there's a lot of benefit to regenerative agriculture and what can be done there. And I think that we have these big agribusinesses making lots of money promoting a fallacy about we need to have more chemicals and more mono production in order to feed population or reduce the population, which they're working on both ends, I guess. But I think that there's a big issue.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good points there, and message of my presentation that working with nature will be much better off than working against nature.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm cognizant of, I'm cognizant of the time. We've got 4 more minutes. I think we could just take one more question. Unfortunately, Brent, if you want to put yours in the chat. But Sharma, have you got a quick question?
Hello, just I want to share one idea. I will take only maybe 1 minute. So my idea is we need to change our focus a little bit, right? We need to encourage. I live in Edmonton, right? And I see there's a lot of lawns there, artificial grass there or something like that. We need to encourage people, if they can grow even 1 pot of food, right, in their garden or something like that. That's going to change all the concept, right? Now we need to teach people, you are growing your own food. That's healthy. That's more beneficial. There's no carbon print. There's no fuel money on it. So we need to focus small things. If we can encourage people to grow a little bit their own food, because mostly, as I seen in presentation, mostly the agriculture lands are taking over on the forestry and other land, right, or wetlands, right? So that can reduce that one, right? And if we focus women on that matter, right, then it's more benefit for everybody, because women, they can teach their kids, right, grow your own food. Even you can grow some herbal or some potato or chili, whatever in your pot, whatever space you have. That every little drop, when everybody put drops in the pool, you can fill that pool with the water. So that's my idea. I'm not expert like you all the guys here, but that's what I'm trying to do. That's why I started growing my own food a little bit. I had a lot of tomato last year, which I still have in my freezer, which I'm using. So I think that's the one idea.
For your input and feedback. Yes, much appreciated. Mary, there was a few more minutes, whether you want to go with one more question, or Gord asked a tricky question, how we can provide incentives for the 1,000, 20,000, and 30,000 acre farmers to adopt sustainable practices. What do you want to go with?
Well, it's we've got 2 minutes, so I don't know if you can address that one in 2 minutes. I really think we should be try to wrap this up on time, just because we've lost people already because of that. So
yeah, it was an hour and a half. So Gord asked a very good question, and that is really a problem. How do we mainstream and how we expand agroecological practices and sustainable agriculture practices on larger number of farms? It is going to be difficult, especially those larger farms are really focused on maximum in so-called efficiency, and studies show that those large farms are really not practicing a lot of sustainable agriculture practices. It's more kind of a bottom line to increase the profit, regardless of environmental cost. And that is really society needs to decide, how do we go forward? So what I wanted to ask you is, for example, try to put a hand in your pocket and let me know if you found $1.7 billion in your pocket. I will wait 10 seconds for you to answer, but my guess is they will not find 1.7 billion, because that's how much money government took out of your pocket, yours and mine, to support oil and gas industry to clean up abandoned wells. So we are working, we kind of weird approach to have a private profit and social cost. So that is something that we really have to deal with as a society. Where do we want to provide support to producers, and how do we provide support to producers which incorporate that environmental and social cost in a food production? So there are various, I can't go into details, there are lots of it. But as a society, we really have to think about it. Otherwise, we'll just wasting money.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a systems approach, as you mentioned right at the beginning of your talk. We need policies, we need the changing demand, supply. I mean, the whole works needs to change. That's why we call it food system transformation. Thanks, Branimir, so much for igniting this conversation. I think we could easily go on another 3 to 5 hours here. And thanks to everyone for joining today. This has been a really enlightening conversation, and I know needs to be continued.